welcome to Writing Off the Deep End.
I'm Geoffrey Edwards.
And I'm Mary Thaler. And we're talking about poetry today.
Right. So I was just thinking, might as well start out with that. Because we've talked a lot about writing in the other episodes, but we rarely talk about our influences in writing. And I think in the area of poetry, influences matter somehow. So,
what are the major poets for you? The ones that you.
I carry around. Well, I carry around two little volumes with me of poetry. One is T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, which I consider phenomenal, and the other is a little book of Keats poems that my mother gave me to me many years ago. Keats is another poet that I really like, although I probably write like neither of them. So.
But there must be elements of what they write that you would strive for in your own poetry.
I mean, T.S. Eliot I like because there's a kind of spirituality to his writing, but there's also a very personal focus as well. So it's this mix of a broader framework and a very personal framework that I really like in his writing.
Okay. And Keats?
Keats I think it's the sensuality of the writing that I did extremely sensuous. And so that really appeals.
And that's part of what poetry does best, is it puts you right up against the sensual reality of things. That's what it's trying to do. Some poems tell stories, but many poems are just trying to give you a very vivid experience of a state of mind or a sensory experience that the poet is trying to give to you.
So do you have influences, poets that you admire?
I read a lot of poetry, but most of the poetry I read is in journals and magazines, and so I'll sitting down for an hour, I'll read 10 or 12 different ones, and images will stay with me, and I feel moved. I've been reading some Patricia Young recently. She's a Canadian poet who does a lot of poems from the perspective of animals. And, of course, I write a lot of stories from the perspective of animals. And I think in poetry, like I said, is suited well to this conveying a different state of mind. And sometimes that different state of mind is the state of mind of a mouse or a lizard. So I have a collection by her that does that. The other kind of poetry that I read a lot, when the magazines and journals, I'm reading modern poetry, but I also really love old formal poetry. And what I'm really crazy about is sonnets. I love the structure of sonnets. I think they are like little essays in which you have 8 lines setting up your argument, and then 6 lines answering the argument, and the beauty of that is perfect, and it's a lovely size.
The other source of poetry is Quebecois poetry that I have. So this is partly, my wife was a poet, so that's an indication of how important poetry is to me. And through her, I got to know a number of very important Quebec poets. Yeah. And have kept up with the reading of Quebec poetry. So it's interesting because I'm now interacting more with people, Americans, for instance, who are more clued into the poetry scene, the contemporary poetry scene in the United States, which I know almost nothing about. Yeah. But I have this strong background in writing in French, in poetry in Quebec, which is a very different poetry scene.
You're not primarily a poet, but you do write a not insignificant amount of poetry, I would say.
I think poetry is really important for any writer, I think, because we've talked about the fact that I like the larger forms, novellas and larger structures, but poetry gives me the opportunity to focus on the word level. And I think that is, I mean, ultimately, that's the tool we have as writers, are words and sentences.
Yeah.
And if you don't pay attention to those things, you're never going to be able to do the job, as it were. And so I think poetry is interesting for that. And of course, it has a kind of intuitive grounding that no other form of writing has, I think.
That's a really interesting way to put it. Do you mean grounded in like our bodily experience?
That in part, and also our emotional lives. So it's and our sensory experience of the world, right? So
So can you describe to me your writing process for poetry? Is it different than writing prose?
Well, I've been writing a series of poems recently, so I'm developing a new collection of poetry. A new collection, in a way, it's my first collection because I've done small projects in the past, but not a larger collection before. And I was on vacation for a week in Toronto, and 5 poems poured out at me in the week that I was in Toronto. And when I got back home, and work and the rest of it caught up with me, I could no longer write the same way. I mean, it requires a kind of relaxation, I find, to write poetry that is hard. So my science world doesn't let me relax that way. Yeah. And there are poems that I wrote where I write and I almost don't touch them afterwards. Yeah. But there are other ones that I write and I have to sort of hammer away and rewrite and I'm fiddle with for sometimes months before I'm happy with it, So it's this odd combination or difference between the one types of poems and the other, So
now, we've talked a lot in these episodes about how the physical way that you write matters. I find that I write poetry differently, like my process, how much I write by hand and when it gets put onto a computer and so on.
Because I'm still writing directly on the computer.
You type it directly?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Line by line in the order that they come out, or do they end up rearranged a lot?
Yeah. Well, it goes line by line, but often it stops. And then there's a need because it gets stuck.
Yeah.
And then you can't push it forward. You sort of have to back up and say, okay, I've got to reorganize what I've got in order to be able to go forward. So it's not a direct writing process, So
for me, that's why I have to write mine by hand first, is because the very first step for me is to jot down images and phrases that I know are all part of the same poem, and they're all kind of coalescing, and I write them down on the page, but they're not in anything like the order of a poem. They just had to get down on the page, and then the next step is to draw arrows and use numbers to say, oh, here's line 1, line 2, and finally the page gets so messy that I can't even be sure what it is anymore, and then it has to be typed up, and then it's moved onto the computer, and I work on it.
So that sounds very much like the way you describe your writing in prose.
It's true. But I think it's just even more intense for poetry. It's well, maybe that is just my writing process generally.
Some of the American collaborators that I have been helping me figure out how to structure poems on the page in a way that uses the visual.
Yeah.
So sliding lines forward on the page and things that I wasn't necessarily drawn to do personally. But once I see the results, I think, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is good.
So we've talked about how poetry is wonderful in its own right, but also helps hone your writing in a way that's useful for prose. Could you talk a bit about how your poetry and your prose have cross-pollinate?
Yeah, so I use poems in my novels now. In my science fiction novels, I have a section that's an epic poem. So done in Homeric style with the iambic sextameter style of lines. So, which I love. Again, I love doing that. Just writing that segment, it was like the opera libretto that we talked about last time. I just love the sort of, it's not the rhyming, although I do like the rhyming, but it's what's interesting with the rhyming is the internal rhymes within lines, right? So not necessarily the rhyming at the end of the line, but the internal resonances that I love, and the rhythms are also it's wonderful work with rhythms. One of my favorite poets is Gerard Manley Hopkins, who wrote a lot of sonnets, but his sonnet style is so interesting because he breaks up the traditional da-da, 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 da-da rhythms with English-specific rhythms that give you these unusual rhythms inside the poetry, and I love that. So I kind of want more poetry in my writing, but it's not always easy to integrate. Right?
Well, and we've talked about that, the state of mind that poetry requires.
Yeah, it requires this sort of...
Make space for it in your life as well is challenging. Oh, well, that's about it for poetry. We hope you'll join us for the next episode.
We're going to be talking about another subject a little bit. It's a common interest we both have in different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about spirituality and religion in relationship to writing, not necessarily in any sort of, or not always in a traditional sense. We're going to talk about it in some other ways as well. So.
It's going to be exciting.
yeah.
Exciting topic. So I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, please subscribe. And
we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Yes.
Bye-bye.